Their first glimpse of a human battleship in that moment there. Destruction became clear. The human ship was already inside our perimeter before my tactical officer even noticed it. That was the first thing that should have warned me. In 41 years of commanding Dominion warships, no vessel had ever crossed our perimeter without triggering every sensor array on my bridge. Our detection grid was the finest in the known galaxy. We had spent centuries refining it. And yet there it was, a small, battered human transport drifting through the outer edge of the Kepler corridor like a leaf caught in a current. No alarm. No warning light. Nothing. My second officer, a young tactical analyst named Drev, spotted it visually. He was looking at the external feed out of habit, not necessity. He called my name quietly, the way junior officers do when they are not sure if what they are seeing is real. I turned from the star charts and looked at the screen. The vessel was ugly. There was no other word for it. Human ships always had that quality. They looked assembled rather than designed, as if someone had taken the practical solution to every problem and bolted all the answers together without caring what the result looked like. This one had scorch marks along its port side. One of its stabilizer fins was partially bent. Its running lights flickered on the left. It was broadcasting a frequency I recognized immediately, the universal diplomacy code repeated in a slow loop. Patient and quiet. Let it through, I said. Drev hesitated. Admiral Kael'thas's protocol requires. I know what protocol requires, I said. Let it through. This was how it worked. The Dominion had absorbed 47 civilizations over the course of 3 centuries. The process was never pleasant, but it was always predictable. A species would resist. They would fight with everything they had, and then eventually, after enough losses, they would send a small ship to a neutral point broadcasting that slow, patient frequency. They would send someone to talk. The talking was always the end. After the talking came the terms. After the terms came the absorption. I had seen it 11 times in my own career. I knew exactly how these meetings felt. I expected this one to feel the same. The human transport docked at our secondary bay. My security team escorted their delegation to the meeting chamber, a plain gray room near the center of the ship where the gravity stabilizers kept everything steady. I had chosen it deliberately. No windows. No view of the stars outside. I wanted them focused on the conversation, not on the sight of my fleet surrounding them. There were 4 humans in the delegation. 3 of them I dismissed immediately. Aides, assistants, the kind of people who carry documents and say nothing. The 4th one walked in front. Her name was Admiral Laura Graves. She was not tall. She was not physically imposing. She had short gray hair cut close to her head, and she wore a dark uniform that had no decorations on it except a small pin on the left side, the emblem of the Human Earth Defense Council. She walked to the chair across from mine, without waiting for an invitation to sit. She sat down, placed a small data chip on the table between us, and looked at me. She did not look afraid. That was not unusual. Most diplomats were trained to hide fear. What was unusual was that she did not look tired either. Every other species representative I had ever met in a room like this had carried The weight of what was happening in their eyes, the exhaustion of a people who had been fighting and losing and finally come to accept the inevitable. Laura Graves looked like someone who had arrived early for an appointment and was simply waiting for the other party to catch up. Admiral Kale Voss, she said. Her translator rendered her words cleanly into our language. I appreciate you allowing our ship through. It is standard procedure, I said. Of course. She glanced around the room once. Briefly. No windows. I find them distracting. She almost smiled. Practical. She placed one hand flat on the table. I will not waste your time with introductions you already have in your files. I have one message to deliver, and I would prefer to deliver it clearly. Please, I said. She did not reach for a prepared document. She did not consult any of her aides. She simply looked at me and spoke. The Earth Defense Council is directing the Dominion fleet to withdraw from the Kepler corridor and all associated approach vectors within 72 hours. After that time, if Dominion vessels remain in the corridor, the Council will consider there an active act of aggression and will respond accordingly. For a moment, the room was completely silent. I heard Drift shift his weight behind me. I heard one of the human aides draw a slow breath. I kept my face neutral because I had spent 4 decades learning to keep my face neutral, but I will be honest, the statement surprised me. Not because it was bold. Plenty of species had tried bold statements in their final negotiations. What surprised me was the specific word she had used. Respond. Not defend. Not retaliate. Respond. As if they had something planned. As if the 72 hours were not a request, but a courtesy. That is a significant demand, I said, keeping my voice level. It is the only demand, she said. I looked at the data chip on the table. And this supporting material, she said. You should look at it before the deadline. She pushed it forward an inch. I would encourage you to look at it soon. One of my officers reached past me and collected the chip. I did not pick it up myself. I would not give her the satisfaction of watching me reach for it. The Dominion fleet has held the Kepler corridor for 14 months, I said. We have established supply lines, communication relays, and forward positions throughout the region. You are asking us to surrender a strategic zone we have invested heavily in securing. I am not asking, she said. She said it without any sharpness, without any aggression. She said it the way someone states a fact about the weather. The silence came back. Longer this time. I studied her face and found nothing I could use. No angle of desperation, no flicker of uncertainty. Behind her, her 3 aides stood with their hands at their sides, all of them. Looking at the floor, all of them, I realized, not looking at me on purpose. The way people look away from something they are not supposed to react to. Something they have been briefed not to react to. The Dominion does not withdraw, I said. In 47 engagements across 3 centuries, we have never ceded ground. Under pressure. You are aware of our record. I am, she said. Then you understand that this meeting can only end in one way. She looked at me for a moment. Then she stood up. Her aide straightened immediately, moving toward the door without being told. She picked up nothing from the table. The data chip stayed where she had left it, in the exact center of the space. Between us, 72 hours, she said. Not as a reminder, as a closing statement. She walked out of the room without looking back. I sat in the meeting chamber for a long time after her ship departed, looking at the data chip on the table. My officers waited. Nobody spoke. Get me the intelligence reports on human shipyard activity, I finally said. Everything from the last 6 months. Drev moved quickly. We have some, sir. Long-range scans only. Human space has been increasingly difficult to probe. They have been jamming our deeper survey arrays for approximately 4 months. Jamming them, I said. Yes, sir. We assumed it was a defensive measure. Standard behavior for a species in a losing conflict. I looked at the chip. Or they did not want us to see something. Drev did not answer. He did not need to. I reached out and picked up the chip. I held it in my hand for a moment, feeling its weight, which was nothing. It was a small thing, lighter than a stone. I turned it over once. I did not play it that evening. I placed it in my personal records unit and left it there because I was still operating on the assumption that I knew exactly how the situation would develop. The humans would wait out their 72 hours. Nothing would change. We would remain in the corridor. They would accept it because they had no other choice. The data chip was a gesture, a piece of theater. I had seen it before. I told myself that as I walked back to my command post. I told myself that, and I almost believed it. What I could not stop thinking about, walking through the corridors of my own flagship, surrounded by the hum of the most powerful fleet the Dominion had assembled in a generation, was a single word. Respond. Not defend. Not retaliate. Not fight back. Respond. As if she already knew exactly what would happen next and had simply come to give me the chance to avoid it. I did not sleep well that night. I told myself it was nothing, but something in my chest had shifted very slightly, and I could not put it back. The silence came from the wrong direction. I do not mean that in a poetic sense. I mean it literally. My long-range listening array picked up the absence of 3 probe signals simultaneously, and when my communications officer plotted the positions of the lost probes on the navigation chart, all 3 of them were in a region of space where silence had no natural cause. There were no stellar phenomena in that area, no known interference sources, no asteroid fields dense enough to destroy a probe without leaving a debris signal. The probes had simply stopped transmitting one after another across a stretch of 48 hours, and the space they disappeared into looked completely empty. On every skin we ran. I was eating my morning meal when the report landed on my desk. I read it twice before I set it down. Then I pulled up the chart myself. 20 years ago, early in my command career, I had served on a patrol vessel in the outer rim of Dominion territory. We had encountered a species there, small, aquatic, with no significant military capability, that had developed a peculiar defensive adaptation. When a predator entered their territory, they did not flee. They went still. They became part of the environment. A patrol ship could sweep a whole region and detect nothing, and then the moment you looked away, they would be everywhere. My commanding officer at the time had explained it to me in simple terms. The absence of a signal is itself a signal. What you cannot find is often more important than what you can. I had not thought about that lesson in years. I thought about it now. Drev, I said, pull the last known headings of the 3 lost probes. He did. The headings, when overlaid on the navigation chart, were pointing toward a region approximately 40 million kilometers off the ecliptic plane of the human solar system. Not toward Earth. Not toward any of the human colony worlds we had catalogued. Toward a point in space that, according to every survey we had conducted in the last 3 years of this conflict, contained absolutely nothing. What does our gravitational mapping show for that region? I asked. Drev checked. He looked up slowly. It shows some anomalies, sir. We attributed them to a minor dark matter concentration. The readings are not dramatic. How long have those readings been there? He searched. They first appeared approximately 9 months ago. 9 months. I let that number sit in my mind. The humans had jammed our deep survey arrays 4 months ago. Before that, for 5 months, something had been generating a gravitation signature in an empty patch of space. And we had looked at it once, labeled it a dark matter concentration, and moved on. Run a comparison, I said. Pull the gravitational profiles of our largest warships and compare the signature curves. Drev ran the comparison. He did not say anything for a long time. When he turned around, his expression was careful and controlled in the way that tells you something is wrong. The anomaly has a profile consistent with a very large artificial structure. He said, something with significant mass. Significantly more mass than anything we have on record for human shipbuilding. I stared at the chart. 9 months. The humans had been fighting us, losing ground, retreating across 3 separate fronts, taking losses that by any standard measure of military analysis should have forced their surrender 8 months ago, and for all 9 of those months something had been sitting in an empty patch of space 40 million kilometers off their ecliptic, growing heavier. I reached across my desk and opened the drawer where I had placed Admiral Graves' data chip. I held it for a moment. Then I crossed the room to the display terminal and inserted it. The file opened immediately. It was not a speech. It was not a diplomatic document or a list of terms or any of the things I had expected. It was a sensor log, a raw feed from a human monitoring station, timestamp 14 days ago, showing the interior of what I can only describe as a construction bay the size of a small moon. The bay was built inside a hollowed asteroid. I could see the curved rock walls in the background of the feed, dark and rough. The interior was lit by enormous work lamps, thousands of them arranged in rows along the ceiling like artificial stars. And in the center of the bay, suspended in a construction cradle that dwarfed every piece of engineering I had ever seen, was a ship. I am not going to pretend that I immediately understood what I was looking at, because I did not. My mind tried to process the scale of it and could not find the right frame of reference. It was the way your vision sometimes struggles in the dark. You know something is there, but you cannot resolve the details. I kept looking for a reference point, something in the frame I could use to measure the object against. I found one eventually, a human worker, on a scaffold near what I assumed was the bow of the vessel. The worker was tiny. The worker was so tiny that I had initially thought the figure was a sensor artifact. The ship was 14 km long. I know that number because the file included a specification summary at the end. 14 km. A weapon system in every sense except the human one. They had given it a name. Not a classification number. A name. The way humans name things they care about. The name was painted on the side of the bow in letters large enough to read even in the distance of the feeds. Perspective. Thermopylae. I had to access my historical database to find the reference. Thermopylae was a place on Earth, a narrow pass where thousands of years ago a small number of soldiers had held a position against an army vastly larger than themselves. They had not survived, but they had held long enough to change the outcome of the war that followed. I stood in front of the display terminal for a very long time. Drev knocked on my door. I did not answer. He knocked again. I turned off the display, walked back to my desk and sat down. There was a second file on the chip. I had almost missed it. It was small. Text only, a single line from Admiral Graves herself. Not part of the official transmission. A personal note added to the end of the data package. It read, "This is the oldest one." I read it 3 more times. Then I put the chip back in my drawer and called for my senior staff. The briefing I gave them was controlled and precise. I told them we had intelligence, suggesting the humans had developed a new class of vessel. I told them the vessel was large. I told them we needed more information before the 72-hour window closed. I told them to intensify scanning in the target region using every array we had. What I did not tell them was what I had felt reading that single line from Graves. That cold, very specific feeling that comes not from fear of a thing but from the sudden understanding that you have been thinking about a situation incorrectly from the very beginning. The oldest one. Not the only one. The oldest one. Which meant there were others. Newer ones. Ones built after the Thermopylae. Improved on its design, standing somewhere in the dark, pointed outward. I thought about Graves sitting across from me in that windowless room, placing the chip on the table with one hand, looking at me without fear or exhaustion. And I understood with a slow and terrible clarity that her expression had not been the composure of a diplomat trained to hide weakness. It had been the composure of someone who was holding a very good hand and had already decided to play it and was simply waiting for the other side to give her a reason. The 72-hour deadline had 31 hours left. I did not sleep at all that night. At hour 29, my scanning arrays finally locked onto the gravitational anomaly with enough resolution to resolve a solid object. The screen showed a shape 14 km long, sitting perfectly still in the dark with no lights on, just sitting there, waiting. I stared at it for a long time. Then I called my fleet to battle. Formation. I was still telling myself I knew how this would end. The 72 hours expired at 400 ship time. And nothing happened. For exactly 11 minutes, nothing happened. I had my fleet arranged in a forward wedge formation, 2,000 warships spread across a front line that stretched 500 km from edge to edge. It was the largest single force the Dominion had committed to a single engagement in 60 years. I had called it in from 3 separate fleets, pulling resources from 2 other active fronts because I wanted this moment to be final and total and unmistakable. I wanted the humans to see us and understand that there was no version of the next few hours in which resistance was rational. I stood on my bridge and watched the clock pass 0 and watched the Kepler corridor hold its silence, and for 11 minutes I thought perhaps Graves had been bluffing after all. Then Drev said, very quietly, "Admiral, behind the moon." I turned to the external display. The human moon, their largest natural satellite, the gray-white body that had watched over their planet for billions of years, sat in the distance where it always sat, calm and still. And from behind it, moving without any of the heat signatures or exhaust trails that any propulsion system we had ever studied would produce, something came. It did not rush. That was the first thing I noticed. It did not accelerate dramatically or power up in a way designed to intimidate. It simply moved out from behind the moon, the way a large animal moves when it is not in a hurry, steadily, deliberately, with the easy confidence of something that does not need to announce itself. The Thermopylae. My display tried to render it and struggled. The ship was so large that the targeting system kept attempting to classify it as a spatial body rather than a vessel, kept trying to assign it a mass index rather than a threat designation. I watched the system correct itself 3 times in the span of 10 seconds. 14 km of black hole, darker than the space around it, not because of any stealth technology but because the material itself absorbed light rather than reflecting it. The hole looked like a hole in the universe. It looked like the galaxy had a tear in it and something had come through. It was broadcasting. Open frequency, standard audio, no encryption. The voice that came through was calm and professional, a human male voice that belonged to someone who had given this transmission many times in practice and was now delivering it for real without any audible tension. "This is Captain Owen Hale of the Earth Defense Ship Thermopylae. The 72-hour window has closed. All Dominion vessels in the Kepler corridor are directed to withdraw immediately. This is the final communication before the Earth Defense Council authorizes active response. Captain Owen Hale out." A simple transmission. No threats detailed. No descriptions of what would happen. Just a name, a ship name, a direction, and a closing. The way someone gives a final instruction before getting to work. For a moment, my entire bridge was silent. Then someone behind me laughed. It was a short, nervous laugh, the kind that is not really about humor, but about releasing pressure. I heard 2 others join it briefly. 2,000 ships. We had 2,000 ships. One of my fleet captains came over the command channel and said, "Admiral, should we hold position?" I looked at the Thermopylae on my display. It had stopped moving. It was sitting approximately 80,000 km from the leading edge of my formation. Perfectly still, its bow pointed directly at us. At this distance, with our sensor resolution, I could see details of its hull, weapon systems, many of them arranged in configurations I had never seen in any human vessel we had cataloged in any intelligence report. Going back 3 years of conflict. My targeting officer was already running. Analysis. Admiral, I am reading weapon systems. Across the bow and forward lateral. Sections. Classification is difficult. The energy. Signatures do not match any known human. Armament profile. Estimated capability. A pause. I cannot estimate capability, sir. I do not have reference data. An unknown weapon system on a ship built. In secret, sitting between my fleet and human space waiting. I made my decision. All weapons free, I said. Target the vessel's propulsion and primary hull. Full coordinated strike, all forward. Batteries. The order went out across 2,000 ships. Simultaneously. The Kepler corridor lit up. I have commanded fleet engagements. Before. I know what a coordinated strike looks like, the way energy weapons from multiple ships converge on a target. Point, the way the combined fire creates a brightness that washes out the display. Sensors for a fraction of a second before the image recovers and shows you the result. I know exactly what that moment looks like when it works. Our fire reached the Thermopylae, and the Thermopylae did not move. It did not evade. It did not attempt any defensive maneuver. It sat completely still as tens of thousands of energy bolts, plasma, lances, and kinetic rounds from the most powerful fleet the Dominion had assembled in 60 years struck its hull. Across every angle of approach, the impacts lit up its surface. I watched the display show impact flash after impact flash, rolling across 14 km of black hole, bright points of energy, flaring and fading, and the ship just sat there absorbing it unaffected, the way a mountain absorbs rainfall. My bridge went very quiet. The ship kept taking our fire for 11 seconds. I counted 11 seconds of the full output of 2,000 Dominion warships, and when those 11 seconds ended and our battery cycled for a second charge, the Thermopylae was still there, still pointed at us, still completely still. Then it responded. It used one weapon, a single system mounted along the forward center line of the ship, which activated with a low, deep energy signature that our sensors registered as a gravitational distortion rather than an energy weapon. There was no visible beam. There was no light. The space between the Thermopylae and my forward line simply changed briefly, the way air changes when something very heavy moves through it. 17 of my warships stopped existing. I want to be precise about that word. Stopped. They did not explode. There was no shockwave, no debris field, no structural failure cascade. The sensor returned from those 17 ships simply ceased all at once in a fraction of a second, and where they had been, there was now an odd visual distortion. A region of space that looked slightly wrong, slightly too flat, as if the universe had been pressed at that point by something very large and then released. The distortion faded within seconds. There was no trace left of the ships, no fragments, no energy signatures of damaged systems. Nothing. 17 warships gone. My bridge crew had stopped moving. I do not mean they froze in the dramatic sense of a crisis moment. I mean the ordinary, continuous small movements that people make on a bridge. Adjusting controls, turning to consult. Displays, shifting weight from foot to foot, all of those had stopped. Every person on my bridge had gone as still as the Thermopylae itself, and they were all staring at the main display, and nobody was saying anything. I heard my own breathing. I looked at the display. The Thermopylae was already charging the weapon again. I could see the gravitational distortion building along its center line, the same subtle signature that had preceded the first strike. All stopped, I said. The order went across the fleet. It was the correct tactical decision. It was also the only decision I could make because something in my mind had already done the arithmetic and reached a conclusion that my training was still trying to reject. We were 2,000 ships against one. We had delivered our full strike and produced no effect. They had delivered one response and removed 17 of my warships from existence without leaving any evidence they had ever existed. If the exchange continued at that ratio, I did not have enough ships. I did not have enough ships in the entire Dominion fleet. Get me Admiral Graves, I said. There was a pause. Then Drev said, she is already on the channel, sir. She has been waiting. I took a breath. Admiral Graves. Admiral Kale Voss. Her voice was the same as it had been in that windowless room. Steady, not triumphant. I am glad you stopped. I am withdrawing my fleet from the corridor, I said. The words were the hardest I had ever spoken in my career. I know, she said. I want to understand something, I said. The data chip you left. You said the Thermopylae was the oldest. A pause. Just a brief one. Yes, she said. How many? Another pause. Longer. I thought she might not answer. Then she said 12. We finished the 12 3 weeks ago. The Thermopylae is assigned to this corridor because it was available. The others are assigned elsewhere. Elsewhere? I did not ask where. I did not want to know, not yet, not while I was still on the bridge trying to give orders in a voice that sounded like a commanding officer. You should have shown me the chip. Immediately, I said. When you placed it on the table. I did, she said. I placed it within your reach. You chose to wait. Another pause. That was not something I could control. She was right. She had given me the information. I had decided it was theater. The corridor is yours, I said. It always was, she said simply, and closed the channel. I stood on my bridge for a long moment, staring at the display where the Thermopylae sat motionless and dark, watching my fleet turn and begin the long, slow process of withdrawal. It did not follow us. It did not need to. It simply remained where it was, holding the corridor, as patient as the asteroid that had hidden it while it was built, as quiet as the months of silence we had interpreted as evidence of a dying species. I watched it on the display until we were too far away to see it clearly. Then I went to my chair and sat down. And for the first time in 41 years of military command, I had absolutely nothing to say. I filed my after-action report alone in my quarters at a desk that faced a wall, because I did not want to look at the stars outside. I had spent my entire career drawing meaning from the stars, using their positions to orient myself, using the sight of them to remind me of the scale of the Dominion's reach, all the space we controlled, all the systems flying. Our marker, looking at them, now felt different. I was not sure I was ready for how different. The report began with the standard headers: date, engagement, location, forces, involved, outcome. I filled them in automatically by habit, the way you do things you have done 1,000 times. When I reached the section titled Outcome Classification, I sat for a long time before I typed anything. In 41 years, in every engagement I had ever commanded or participated in or observed at a distance, that section had contained one of three classifications: total dominion victory, partial dominion victory, or tactical withdrawal by mutual agreement. There was no other category. The classification system had never needed one. It had been written by people who assumed those three categories would always be sufficient. I created a new one. I called it strategic withdrawal under superior force. I entered it. I moved on. The factual section was straightforward enough. Engagement duration, forces committed, losses. When I entered the losses, 17 ships all hands, 0 recovered personnel, 0 recovered wreckage. The report system flagged the entry as a potential data error. It ran a check and highlighted the line in amber, the color the system used when it suspected a recording mistake. 17 ships lost in a single engagement, with 0 recovered material was outside the parameters of anything the system had been designed to record. It assumed someone had made an arithmetic error. I confirmed the entry manually and moved on. The analysis section was where I stayed longest. In the Dominion's 3 centuries of expansion, we had encountered many resistant species. Some fought longer than others. Some were more creative in their tactics. Some had developed weapons we had not anticipated, required us to adapt our approach, cost us more time or resources than initially projected. But in every case, every single case, across 47 absorptions, the pattern had held. A species fights with what it has. When what it has runs out, it adjusts its terms for surrender. The variables were always about quantity and duration, not about the fundamental shape of the outcome. Humanity had not followed the pattern. And sitting at my desk writing that analysis, I needed to understand exactly why. Because if I submitted a report that did not explain it, my report would be useless, and I was not in the habit of filing useless reports. I pulled up everything we had on human history. Our cultural database was substantial. The Dominion always studied a species extensively before engaging with it, because understanding behavior was the most efficient path to predicting resistance and shortening conflict. I had read summaries of human history before the war began. I had considered the species carefully. I had concluded, as every analyst in the Dominion had concluded, that humanity was a capable but limited civilization, courageous but ultimately constrained by its own divisions and its relatively young technological base. What I had missed, what we had all missed, was a pattern that ran through human history so consistently it should have been the first thing we flagged. Humans do not respond to being outmatched by accepting defeat. They respond to being outmatched by changing what they are building. I found example after example in their own historical records. A small group of island nations facing an empire that controlled most of their known world did not accept subordination. They developed naval technology that shifted the balance of power so completely that within 2 generations, the empire had collapsed. A nation that could not match its rivals In troop numbers built a series of devices that rendered traditional troop numbers irrelevant. A civilization facing resource scarcity did not reduce its ambitions. It developed extraction and processing methods that created abundance from what had previously been considered waste. Every time humans encountered a ceiling, a point where the conventional approach was not going to work, they went around the ceiling. They treated limits as information rather than as instructions. They looked at the thing that was stopping them and asked not, how do we push harder, but what are we going to build that makes this obstacle irrelevant? We had given them 3 years of losing. 3 years of being pushed back, losing territory, losing ships, losing ground. We had watched their numbers decrease and their supply lines stretch, and we had calculated their breaking point with complete confidence. What we had not calculated was that for every month they had spent losing, they were also spending that month in the shipyard above their gas giant and in the hollowed asteroid 40 million kilometers off their ecliptic and in whatever other locations our probes had not reached before going silent. They were pouring everything they had, every resource, every engineer, every hour of production capacity into building something that would make the obstacle irrelevant. And they had built 12 of them. I set down my writing instrument and looked at the wall. I thought about a captain named Owen Hale. His voice on the transmission had been calm and professional, a man doing a job he had prepared for. I thought about the crew of the Thermopylae, how many of them engineers and gunners and navigators and medics had spent years in that asteroid bay, building the ship they were now stationed on, knowing that when the day came they would be the first human vessel to meet the full strength of the Dominion fleet with everything that implied. They had done it anyway, not because they did not understand the risk, but because they had calculated the alternative and found it unacceptable. A species that does not calculate risk is reckless. A species that calculates risk fully, understands it completely, and proceeds anyway, that is something else. That is something the Dominion's classification system had no category for. I returned to the analysis section and kept writing. The 12 battleships the Dominion Intelligence Division had begun calling them battleships in the preliminary reports, but the humans seemed to prefer the term defense ships, a distinction I was beginning to understand were not the most alarming part of what I needed to report. The most alarming part was what the existence of 12 battleships implied about human production capacity over a 3-year window while simultaneously fighting a losing war. We had underestimated their industrial base by a factor I was still trying to quantify. Every Dominion projection of human manufacturing had been based on their visible facilities, the ones our long-range surveys had cataloged before the war began and monitored at the margins during it. We had not accounted for what could not be seen. We had not seriously considered that they might have concealed facilities, specifically for the purpose of building something we were not supposed to know about until they were ready. The asteroid, the jammed survey arrays, the probes that disappeared. It had all been deliberate, and it had all been coordinated, and it had worked perfectly. We had spent 3 years assuming the silence in that region of space was the silence of emptiness. It had been the silence of an enormous Machine running at full capacity, very quietly while we looked elsewhere. I thought about what Graves had said too. Me in that windowless room. You should look at it before the deadline. Not you might want to, or it would be worth your time. You should. The word of someone stating an obligation. She had known that if I looked at the chip immediately, I might make a different decision. She had not hidden the chip. She had placed it in my hands and trusted, correctly as it turned out, that my own certainty would cause me to delay. That was not arrogance on her part. It was knowledge of how we thought. They had studied us too. My report's analysis section ran to 4 times the usual length. When I finished it, I read it back and it still felt insufficient because the problem with trying to describe fundamental miscalculation is that the words always sound smaller than the thing they are describing. I wrote that we had underestimated humanity's adaptive capacity. I wrote that we had interpreted their losses as evidence of weakness rather than as information they were using. I wrote that the silence we had misread as absence had in fact been the sound of construction. None of those sentences, accurate as they were, fully captured the feeling of standing on my bridge watching 17 warships cease to exist in silence, with no debris, no trace, as the ship that had removed them sat in the dark and waited to see what I would do next. I added a final paragraph to the analysis. I wrote it carefully, in language appropriate for a formal military report, and I wrote it knowing that the analysts and administrators who would read my words had likely already begun processing their own versions of what had happened, had already started constructing the narrative they preferred, the one where our withdrawal was a tactical choice rather than a necessity, where the situation was recoverable on our terms. I wrote, the Dominion's historical model assumes that a species under pressure will spend its energy on resistance and will have none remaining for innovation. This assumption was incorrect in the case of humanity. Their response to pressure was not to deplete their resources in resistance, but to redirect a significant portion of those resources toward building a capability that rendered the pressure itself irrelevant. We spent 3 years measuring their resistance. We did not measure what they were building. This was the error. It was a structural error embedded how we evaluate civilizations, and it will not be corrected by addressing this specific situation. It will only be corrected by revising the model. I submitted the report. I sat at the desk for a long time. Afterward, there were protocol steps that came. Next, notifications to forward commands, logistics orders for the withdrawal, preliminary contact with the Dominion, High Council's military oversight committee. I knew all the steps. I would take them. That was what I did. I took the next step and then the next one, because that was the function of command. You kept moving. You did not stop. But I sat for a while longer before I started. I thought about the last line of Graves' personal note, the one added to the end of the data. Jib. This is the oldest one. 6 words. She had chosen them specifically. Not the first one. Not a prototype. The oldest. Meaning the others were newer, improved, built on everything they had learned from building the first. The 12 ships were not 12 copies. They were an iteration, a progression. The Thermopylae was the beginning of something, not the end. I thought about where the other 11 were. I thought about Graves saying they were assigned elsewhere. Elsewhere covered a great deal of territory. The Dominion controlled systems across a wide swath of this galaxy. Our core systems, our supply hubs, our shipyards, our communication relays. Elsewhere could mean anywhere. I thought about what it would mean if each of the other 11 had been assigned to a specific location, the way a key is assigned to a specific lock. I thought about Owen Hale's voice on the transmission, the calm of it, the practiced certainty. A man who had known when he woke up that morning exactly what day it was and what it meant, and had eaten his breakfast and walked to his bridge and done his job without any visible weight on him, because the weight had already been carried. It had been carried for 3 years in that asteroid bay, and now the weight was in the ship around him, and he was simply the person holding the wheel. I had served 41 years in the Dominion military. I had commanded engagements on 14 different fronts. I had sat across from representatives of 11 different civilizations in rooms like that windowless chamber and received their final negotiations and explained to them carefully and without cruelty what came next. I had believed genuinely and completely that I understood how the arc of these situations worked. I had believed it the way you believe in gravity, not because you test it every day, but because it has always been true, and you have no reason to expect it to stop. I understood now that I had been measuring the wrong thing. I had been measuring resistance when I should have been measuring invention. I had been watching the door they were trying to hold shut when I should have been watching the window they were quietly climbing through. Humanity had not won because they were stronger. They had not won because they had some innate quality that made them invincible. They had won because they had looked at the situation they were in, calculated what the conventional response would produce, found that answer unacceptable, and built something else. They had done it quietly in the dark, while absorbing everything we sent at them, and they had finished before we noticed, and then they had sent Graves to give us 72 hours because they were, in the end, more patient than we gave them credit for. She had not come to surrender. She had come to give us a choice. We had made ours. I stood up from the desk. I walked to the small porthole on the side wall of my quarters, a porthole I rarely used because, as I said, I preferred the chart displays, and I looked out at the stars. The Kepler corridor was far behind us. Now, it was in human hands. It had always been in human hands. Graves had said, and she was right, because the Thermopylae had been sitting 40 million kilometers off the ecliptic for months before our meeting, fully built, fully armed, waiting for the 72 hours to run out. We had never truly held it. We had held the idea that we held it, and the idea had been enough until it was not. I looked at the stars and thought about 12 ships moving outward from human space, assigned to locations the Dominion considered secure. I thought about a line from human history I had found during my research, written by a military leader of one of their ancient nation-states after a long campaign that had nearly broken his forces many times. It's over. He had written, "Do not tell me the odds. Tell me what needs to be done." A species that thinks like that when it has nothing is dangerous. A species that thinks like that and then figures out how to build the Thermopylae, while losing is something the Dominions, 3 centuries of expansion, had never prepared us for. I was going to have to explain that to the High Council. I was going to have to find language that conveyed not just what had happened but what it implied about everything that came next. I was going to have to recommend a complete revision of the strategic assessment framework we had used for 60 years. I was going to have to tell people who had never lost a war that they were going to need to think about things they had never needed to think about. None of that felt insurmountable. I had delivered difficult information before. I would deliver it again. That was still my function. But standing at that porthole looking out at the stars, I allowed myself one moment of something I did not usually permit in working hours. I let myself look at the situation plainly, without the filter of strategy or protocol or professional obligation. Just the plain and honest shape of what had happened. We had come to the edge of human space, with 2,000 ships and absolute certainty, and a single vessel, the oldest of 12, had shown us with one weapon and no lost crew and no wasted movement that our certainty had been the most fragile thing in that corridor all along. In that moment, standing at the porthole, I finally understood what I had seen in Graves' eyes in the windowless room. It had not been the composure of a trained diplomat. It had not been the forced calm of someone hiding fear. It had been the quiet of a person who already knew the outcome. She had always known. She had sat across from me and listened to my references to Dominion history and our record of 47 absorptions, and she had listened to all of it, and she had known the whole time what was sitting in the dark 40 million kilometers off her ecliptic, waiting. She had given us a chance. She had placed the chip on the table, and she had said 72 hours, and she had given us every opportunity to make the right choice. We had made a different choice. And now I was standing at a porthole, writing reports while the Kepler corridor sat behind us in human hands, and 12 defense ships moved through the galaxy toward destinations I could not name, assigned to locations I had to assume were chosen very carefully by people who had spent 3 years calculating exactly what came next. I turned away from the porthole. I picked up my communication device and sent a preliminary message to the High Council. I told them the situation required an emergency session. I told them I would present my full report in person. I told them to arrange the session as quickly as possible. Then I sent a second message. It was not in the report. It was not standard procedure. It was a personal communication to Admiral Graves, sent through the open diplomatic channel, no encryption. It said only, I looked at the chip. I understand now. I should have looked sooner. I did not expect a response. I sent it anyway because it was true and because I had spent 41 years believing that truth was the only thing worth building an argument on, and I was not going to stop believing that now simply because the truth was inconvenient. 2 hours later, a response came through the same channel. It said most people do. That is why we always leave the chip on the table. I read it twice. Then I set the communication device down and went back to work. There was a great deal to do. There always is when the world turns out to be larger than you thought it was.